So as we start to work our way down, you can see just on this edge here, so we've got a little bit of a shadow just underneath, which will sort of help that drop in to the area. And then I've got one just on the inside and one just on the edge. Again, you can see it's not real detail, I'm just adding shade to the area. Nice soft subtle shades which starts to give this outer edge some shape again. So not everything needs to be up close detail work. As so far what we've done, we haven't, apart from the odd dot, we haven't really done any excruciating detail work. We've let the stencil do the work for us and just added those shades where they needed to be. So now I'm just going to drop down onto the sort of the bottom jaw part, just to utilise those cuts we did earlier. So with the reference back in place, I'm just going to fold that back and I'm just going to start to add this shading up this side. Now I've got a little bit of a separation up this top part, so I can use the paper, the torn paper if need be, just to help me add that little bit of an edge up to that part. And I'm going to do the same this side. Let's have a look. So now that's given us that little bit more shape to that bottom jaw. So now I'm going to fold this completely in, just for that second, because all I want at this point now is just those pieces out the way, so I can just add this shade just off the bottom of that cheekbone, just to cast that shadow so it ties it in. Just make sure that's dry. And you see this highlighted area that comes in there. I'm going to use my finger again, just to shield off a little bit of that, and just paint that shadow in. So you see how it just gives me that piece there, and the same this side. Just overlap slightly, just to add that piece in there, and it gives you that, it's almost automatic that it adds it in. So just be careful around when using your finger, just to make sure you overlap it slightly. Just test it. If you need to sort of put a little piece of paper with a line, just to make sure that when you sort of, if that's the edge you want to hit, you make sure you hit it. If we've got that line and we're hitting that edge, you can see that we're just about getting used to using it. If not, if using your finger doesn't work for you, don't forget you can always use the shield and just keep it away from the surface slightly, and we can still add in that same effect using a little bit of bounce, so just to give us that shape. So it's coming together quite well. So we can see it's pretty much done up this part. We've got some parts under here which we're pretty much done with as well. And one of the last times I'm going to visit the cutting mat is I'm going to cut out these teeth, mainly because I want to keep those nice and clean. In the reference again, the teeth are the lightest part on there. So I want to cut those out around the edge, just so I can pop them in there while I work around this area and the bottom jaw, leaving us the teeth which are nice and clean, so we can always tint them down to where we need to. So I'm just going to pop in, we're going to cut these out, and I'm going to show you how to do that now. So depending on your actual chosen reference to work with, I want to separate the teeth from the tooth completely to the bone. So even if the teeth of such, they don't stop on this one here, they don't stop there, it stops there. So I want to try, if I can at all possible, keep all these teeth together. It'll just make it easier for me when sort of masking and using it as a shield. If some of the marks you've done, so when we cut out the black area at the beginning, those little triangles between, and you cut through, don't worry, we can just stick a little bit of tape over it. There we go, we've got all our teeth together. We've got the top and the bottom jaw. And so let's pop these in and shield in our teeth area. So just to line the teeth up over with the parts we cut out earlier, I'm just going to line up through there. If I'm struggling to get that to stick, I'm just going to pencil over the tape. It should hold it in. So one of the reasons why I haven't worked anywhere else of this is because there's a couple of lines, and we've got these sort of detail lines that come up just off the teeth and give us the shape of it. Now one of the things is, if I'd have started to add those in without the sort of reference of the teeth there, I'd have just been guessing. So at this point, at least I can count 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and I know that's where that sort of line is, and it's going to come off that edge. So with that in place, again, I'm going to use my finger just as a little guide. Again, remember, you can just use the shield if you need to, and that'll give us that line. Obviously there's another one next to it, just to give it, start to see it gives you that little bit of shape. But what I'm also going to do, I can just freehand it in as well. So nice and light at around about 2-3 inches away. Nice soft stroke, and I can add those in that way. So whichever's easier for you, just to help build that up. And I'm just going to touch really subtly in between the others as well, just to suggest more than anything. There's also a lighter part just in the middle, so you can see this sort of line that's there. So I'm going to add that in as well. So again, just using a finger, and I'm just going to overlap that this side, just to do the same again, just to give us that sort of line. And I'm just going to lightly dust over. Again, really, when you're using this this material, just work nice and light. All we want is that suggestion of all that detail there without actually having to do it in. It's there to help us. We don't want it to look as though we've just stuck a piece of material over the top and painted in. So I'm going to just drop up now. We've got that little piece there. It is a lot darker around this area, but I'm going to do that once I've started to add in some of this detail underneath the sort of cheekbone area. So I'm just going to work off the bottom edge. Now if the light was coming from above, obviously every time there's a lump that comes out, the light would hit it, but there'd be a shadow underneath. So all I'm thinking about doing is, again, nice and soft, it's not too dark, is rather than trying to paint in the shape, I'm just going to paint in the shadows. And you can see it just starts to give it that little bit. We don't need to paint the highlights as such. And then I can use this area. Sometimes what I do when I'm looking at the references, if I send my eyes out of focus, I start to see just this area of where the shading is. So I've got that area. It's a little bit, so I'm going to angle up from this side. And I'm just going to let that natural blend add that shadow in. And the same the other side. Let's just paint the shadows in first. Again, nice and soft, nice and light. And let's just move around a touch. Add that blend. Underneath. So if you haven't, you've probably just heard me do a quick spray out on the side. If you haven't watched, there's a little 3 to 4 minute video of just troubleshooting, having a look at, you know, how I clean the airbrush, how I help eliminate the tip dry and things like that. Give that a quick watch. It just helps you understand why you sort of hear me spraying sort of full trigger off onto the side as well. So there's a couple of bits, sort of these areas here I want to add in as well. So what I can do is just head back to the cutting mat. I can see those there, so instead of going back, I'm just going to put a little cut in the piece. So what I've done is you can just see I've just made that little cut there. So I'm just going to let that flap forward just a touch, so you can see it's sort of lifted, and the same that side, because I can line that back up. I don't want this thing to paint it in for me, but I'm just going to lightly dust in that area, and that will give me those shapes exactly where they're supposed to be. And I'm just going to soften some of the shadows just on the underneath, and then I'm going to just add a little bit of texture just underneath with a couple of little dots. On this lighter area, I'm just going to keep the stencil moving slightly, just to help add, same as you did with the inner eye up this area, just to add that little bit of sort of texture and detail to it, just so it doesn't look too smooth or too flat. So while I've got this there, I'm just going to add, if I look in the reference again, I've got some of this texture in between the teeth, some of that bone texture really. So just between the teeth, I'm going to add just a touch just so you can see. Let's see if I can zoom in for you. And the same on the bottom. Just around those edges. And also I'm just going to work not direct onto it, but I'm just going to keep just inside that shield. I don't want to be too dark, but I'm just going to follow that edge around the teeth, just pretty much the same as reason as why we did with the eyes, when we put that sort of rounded shape, just to give it that little bit of form. I just want to follow that round. Again, I don't want this to be black or too dark. I'm just going to take that off just so you can see. Now we've got nice clean teeth. Again, can potentially look a little odd, but we've got to work there anyway. But we've got all that sort of top area nice and clean in between. We've got all that sort of front jaw and cheekbones all painted in. Again, very, very little strenuous detail work. And we've got this little bit around the bottom to work with as well. So what I'm going to do is the same as you did with the top of the skull. I'm just going to put this sort of shadow along the bottom edge. Just to give you that rounded sort of look to it. And again, I'm going to add just some nice and light just some little sort of detail there, and obviously using our little friend, the flower wrap, just to add that little bit more detail to it. So we've also got a little bit just underneath those, let's get the reference just to see. So we've got this sort of edge just underneath those teeth. So I'm going to just angle downwards slightly, just to start adding this little shadow, mainly because of the angle of the airbrush. It'll just lift it forward, that touch. So we're pretty much laid out with things. Obviously we can adjust some of the values of things, making sure that they're as dark as they need to be. I always increase contrast a little bit more, so I'll probably make these areas a little bit darker. I'll probably just add a little bit more depth, because for something like this, it is a skull. It's meant to be sort of eerie, so I'll always increase the contrast slightly on a few areas. So before we do any more, let's get into that teeth, and I'm going to show you how I normally paint and create sort of teeth on a project like this. So first things first, let's have a look. It's obviously top teeth have gone overbite, so you can see they cast a shadow onto the bottom teeth. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my scalpel and I'm going to cut the top teeth off as close to those lines and keeping it as accurate as possible, because this is going to be the edge of the teeth. So we've got those, should have those separated. So we can use this as a shield on this top to paint in the bottom ones. So let's get these in and start painting in those bottom teeth. Just going to detack the tape slightly because I've got this sort of work up there I don't really want to pull away. So just hold that in. And what I'm going to reach for is just a standard curve shield. So what I'm going to do is I want to line up from what I can see on that edge and just start to paint in the edges of the teeth. So from the center I'm going to work both sides just to add that part, but from the center outwards I always want the front or sort of the more forward tooth to overlap the next one. I'm lining that up too clever, so I'm just going to touch again, and then obviously again the next one, and so on. So each time that most forward tooth tends to sit in front of, so it gives that element of it going backwards anyway. So I'm going to continue on and just add in each part. I'm going to have to darken that. I didn't line that up too clever. So again, each time overlap, 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 just to give us those shapes of the teeth. So if we look back at the teeth, there's this little sort of shadow just on the bottom. So I'm going to want to add those in, and what I'm going to do is I can either use a shield. So if I find a shape just on the bottom of the tooth, I can use that. But I'm going to use my finger just to lightly paint on the end, and that will give us that nice soft little effect that I'm seeing in the reference. So you can see I've made a little sort of mistake there. So if you do at that point, what I can do is I can take out the whole area. So what I'm looking for is a little isolation line, which will be the outer edge. I'm going to go back and paint that in. again, just to give me that edge. So also, just to give them a little bit more of a rounded feel, I'm just going to lightly dust over some of these edges. Not too much, just enough to give them this sort of rounded effect that I'm seeing. So also, the top teeth are obviously casting a shadow over the top, so I can check my distance just to make sure. Might be a little bit, yeah, that's perfect. Around about 3-4 inches away. So I'm just going to cast off that edge, just to give it that shadow over the top. And this should give us an automatic overbite when we lift that up. So now you can see that the front teeth are obviously, or the top teeth are sitting forward to the bottom teeth, so that shadow has literally brought those forward. So I'm going to do the same as we did on the bottom. So I'm going to reach for the shield. I need to line that up and just lightly start to paint in the edge. I'm going to bounce back both sides just to give that a little bit of a gap, just there. The same rule applies each sort of step. As I come to this side, I'm just going to overlap. Obviously be careful of any overspray that comes down so we don't get any curves continuing on to those bottom teeth. And the same applies. So I'm just going to drop my finger and just paint off the tip. You can see I've got a couple of little untidy parts, so before I add any shading to the teeth, I'm just going to take out some of these parts here and clean up some of these bits that are not quite lined up. So the same as before, I'm just going to start to add a little touch of shading to the teeth, just to give them that little bit more of a rounded look, and obviously just to knock them down slightly. So right at this end, I'm going to sort of exaggerate it a little bit more. There'll be the odd little highlight which they tend to have because they're obviously a different sort of texture to the bone, so the teeth tend to have a little bit more of a reflection. And that'll just sort of complete off that area. So let's zoom out and just have a quick look. So overall, we've got pretty much everything in. The only thing I want to do is I just want to darken up these areas here. The reference doesn't show that much of it, but just at distance, I just want to darken some of these teeth just on this back area, because you can see now just by adding that, it's giving it more of a rounded look. So I'm just angling in slightly just to let some of that drift over. And just to give it so it looks like it's sort of coming out and rounding off. So one of the final things I want to do is I'm just going to intensify that line all the way around. So I'm going to need to tape together all of my cutouts just to give me that outer edge. So I've just pieced the sort of outer edge back in. I'm just going to darken up just to give me a little bit of contrast. But what I need to do is I'm going to be careful, because obviously this is being cut about a little bit, and I need to make sure that it lines up as it did before. And there's a chance I'll just need to sort of reposition just a touch so I don't get a double line on the edge. And you see this bottom piece is just slightly off. Just to give that little bit more contrast and a final outline. I almost forgot. Just that little bit inside. So as a project, we're going to ramp up detail a little bit more as we progress, but for a beginner level project, as we move up, we can start to add more realism to the teeth. But this exercise really is about just planning out, no line drawing, and using the reference to help us create the image itself. So you can see, obviously, if you remember, we used all the cutouts for the eyes, for the nose. We've pretty much used everything we could of the reference to help us create it as best as we could. So have fun with it. Don't forget, take your time. Be careful of the texture stencil so we don't get it too structured. But this is a really good, effective painting. And I'm sure that someone, if you was into custom painting or automotive type things, someone would be really pleased with something like that on the top of their tank.